Before I get into this, I should clarify that by African, I mean what's commonly called black. And obviously by European, I mean what's commonly called white. Anyway, European identity became structurally dependent on the idea that civilization, philosophy, mathematics, architecture, and governance were fundamentally European achievements. Greece and Rome were positioned as the twin pillars of Western civilization, and everything before them or outside them was classified as primitive. You see, European identity depends on historical lies, so they have to lie about African history to preserve their collective identity. They have to claim that the Moors, for example, weren't black, and that the ancient Egyptians weren't black either, regardless of the evidence written long before slavery and colonization. The problem for Europeans is that the ancient Greeks didn't have any of their weird racial hang-ups, and therefore they didn't have a problem with acknowledging that they learned a lot of things from the ancient Egyptians. Pythagoras, for example, studied in Egypt, and Herodotus documented Egyptian civilization with profound respect. The ancient Greeks didn't consider themselves the originators. They considered themselves students of a much more ancient African wisdom tradition. The colonization of Africa severed this acknowledged connection because it needed to. You can build a racial theory of false supremacy while also acknowledging that the foundation of your philosophy, religion, mathematics, and architecture came from Africa, where the people you claim to be superior to came from. So the denial isn't just about Egypt, it's about protecting the entire intellectual architecture of white identity from a foundational contradiction. In a sense, Europeans suffer from the same condition as pale and light-skinned Arabs when it comes to African history and their denial of it. What makes this particularly tragic is that both the Arab and European denials are forms of self-alienation. Europeans who built their identity on Greek philosophy are denying the African roots of the very thing they are proud of. And yet, ancient Greek historians openly acknowledged that they learned from the ancient Egyptians, who Diodorus Siculus wrote were colonists sent out by the Ethiopians. And because they can't erase these historical documents, what they do is try to discredit these historians, like Herodotus, for example. On one hand, they call him the father of history, and yet on the other hand, they pretend like he was so stupid he couldn't make basic observations about what the people he saw in Africa when he went there looks like. Interestingly enough, even as late as the 18th century, there were still Europeans who had no problem acknowledging the truth. For example, Count Volney wrote,
"Just think that this race of black men, today our slave and object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and the use of speech. Imagine, finally, that it is in the midst of people who call themselves the greatest friends of liberty and humanity that one has approved the most barbarous slavery, and questioned whether black men have the same kind of intelligence as whites."
And lastly, he wrote,
"There, in Egypt, a people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences. A race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe."
Volney was much more honest about ancient Egypt than most modern European scholars, and yet he wrote those words during slavery. The defense of false history by Europeans and Arabs requires constant psychological maintenance like mockery, dismissal, selective sourcing, and the social punishment of anyone who challenges them. That maintenance cost is itself a sign of how fragile the constructed identity actually is. A genuinely secure cultural identity doesn't need to erase someone else's history to survive. Unfortunately, a significant part of the European and Arab collective identity is based on and is dependent on a historical lie. There's a difference between individuals consciously lying and a civilization organizing itself around a false narrative so thoroughly that the fiction becomes the foundation. Most Europeans and Arabs who hold these beliefs aren't lying, at least not consciously. They genuinely believe what they were taught. They are genuinely ignorant. They don't know any better. What they were taught was itself constructed to serve political and economic purposes. The philosopher Charles Mills called this the epistemology of ignorance, not simply the absence of knowledge, but the active social production of ignorance. This is why Europeans, for example, speak so authoritatively on African civilizations, particularly the ones in North Africa, even though most of them have never actually read a book on African civilizations. They will tell you that North Africans aren't black and have never been black, even though they've read no books on the migratory patterns of ancient Africans. They will say that the ancient Egyptians weren't so-called sub-Saharan Africans, as if black people in Africa only exist below the Sahara. The sad reality is the white supremacists who control European societies have essentially made them stupid and arrogantly ignorant. And whenever a person of African descent reclaims the ancient civilizations Europeans have whitewashed, they get called an Afrocentrist. And yet, human history has actually been written by Eurocentrists who had an inferiority complex which compelled them to whitewash African history and falsely claim themselves to be superior. Only someone who feels deeply insecure would claim to be superior to others, especially when that claim is based on fiction.